Hello, it's Philip Taylor speaking from Richmond Green Chambers in London, and it's my pleasure to review an excellent book from Law Brief Publishing. It's on Neighbours, a practical guide to neighbour disputes and the law by Alexander Walsh. This is an important area. I've given the title for our review, A Superb Guide on What to Do with a Neighbour from Hell, written by Alexander Walsh. And let's have a look at the book first of all, because Law Brief Publishing have produced these relatively short guides. This is the small guide, this one. There's the front of it. Then there's the spine, and then there's the back. You can see some of the other titles in the series that they've got. It runs actually to 104 pages in total. Actually, basically it's 100 pages. There's no index, which is unfortunate. I like indexes. There's a lot of blurb about the publishers at the back, but there's no index, which I think would have been useful. What you've then got at the front is the first front page itself, and then you've got some blurb there, and then a preface, which I've quoted a little bit in the preface from Alexander. Then you've got the content section. I see this practical guide as expanding quite quickly, because the chapters, there are 8 chapters: boundary disputes, rights of way, rights of access, party walls, rights of light, nuisance, and that includes Rylands and Fletcher, other potential disputes like harassment and antisocial behaviour, fireworks, etc., restricted covenants, and ADR on mediation. Then there, right at the back, there's a protocol about boundary disputes, which is an area I have been involved in in the past. It's a can be a very emotional area for a lot of people. There's a supplementary guide as well to that's the actual appendix at the back there. And then what you've got is an introduction talking about the problem of neighbour disputes generally, and in fact he starts off, the second great commandment provided by Jesus is, thou shalt love thy neighbour as thyself. And then we go into a whole series of reasons as to why that doesn't happen. There is some case law mentioned, and not very much, and there's some useful little footnotes. But generally speaking, it's a practical guide, so I think it would be very useful both for practitioners to a limited extent, because we get into a much more detail, generally speaking, when we have the disputes as litigation. But also I think for ordinary people, as lay people, who have got a problem and don't know what to do. And the difficulty with this area is that it covers as I've indicated from the chapter headings, it covers a fairly substantial area of effectively the law of tort, apart from anything else. So let me start off with the review by saying this. Generally known to practitioners and advisors that neighbour disputes remain one of those substantial problems which no one on authority really wants to deal with, because so many people suffer from them, and the figures are really quite astounding if people were honest about how many people have a dispute with their neighbour. The sad fact of life is that the police and the local authorities would prefer to run a mile away rather than tackle them. They make such comments as, this is a civil matter, so we cannot help you, or you should take it to a civil court yourself, and so on. In other words, they don't want to get involved. That therefore remains the lot of the practitioner in the law of tort, where the overlap with criminal law is so often abstruse and wholly unsatisfactory in the modern world. The same can be said with defamation, of course, because it's about money and it costs a lot of money. But again, when it involves land, it can be important, and I've certainly dealt with a number of most interesting, mainly boundary disputes, but sometimes both easements and restrictive covenants. Because the problem is that sufferers of neighbourhood abuse are therefore, I think, very lucky to have this short book by an experienced solicitor in this field, Alexander Walsh. It's available, I think, as a first port of call when matters become contentious, and of course it's an inexpensive practical book from Law Brief Publishing, who publish a whole range of these excellent guides, and they're not meant to be anything other than guides. I mean, if you want the real detail, you either go and see a lawyer or you go and get the main practitioner works. But what you've got here is something which is as I say, first port of call. Alas, it's always a matter of degree, of course, concerning the harm that's being caused and the proportionate cost of dealing with an appalling neighbour, which is so well explained here. And I can say now from the cases I've had that the problem is the costs can rocket very quickly and get completely out of hand. I'm afraid the problems of pride do come into it as well, and that's a difficulty. Before you know where you are, the whole thing has grown out of all proportion. Walsh sums up the position today with these words, though. He says, unfortunately, despite widespread judicial criticism, neighbour disputes remain extremely common. And I think the percentage in London is 45%, which is an awfully high number, but there we go, could well be. He goes on to say, writing that such disputes have also been known to even grab headlines due to the seemingly trivial nature of the dispute and the willingness of the parties to incur a significant amount of legal costs in fighting it. Just think of the Central London County Court cases we see quite frequently, both in the Evening Standard and in the London newspapers. They're dealing quite often with very wealthy people who are having a very substantial fight with their immediate neighbour. As most practitioners know, of course, cost remains the deterrent, as always, when going to law, and that is the problem. But again, as I've said, sometimes it can virtually bankrupt people. It certainly takes away a large amount of their the money they've amassed in fighting what can sometimes appear to other people to be relatively trivial. But it isn't trivial to them. That's the important thing. Now, Walsh's excellent short book takes a detailed look at the different ways in which neighbour disputes can arise, and he covers the types of remedies available to litigants, and he provides us also with practical guidance to assist practitioners on how best to deal with such disputes, which can often prove to be extremely difficult to solve. So it's very much a book, I think, which a litigant in person would have in mind as perhaps the first port of call reader. And I think it will be useful for citizens' advice and law centres. I think student lawyers should find this quite interesting too, because again, there are quite a lot of interesting cases that arise in this area, and of course it does bring out the law of tort fairly substantially. Obviously land law as well, but I'm thinking specifically about the human aspects, if you like, of tort. The final word comes from Alexander Walsh with his introduction, where he cites the second commandment, which I mentioned, thou shalt love thy neighbour as thyself. Walsh comments further that whilst this is of course a metaphorical reference to the way in which people should treat each other, its literal sense is also highly appropriate. It doesn't seem to be that way when I do the cases in court, I have to say, because they can't stand each other, and it's like separating a pack of hounds sometimes with the way that they really want to go at each other in court. As the author says, some people just want their day in court, of course, and the issue remains that when that day arrives, litigants do often find, as with the police and councils, that they are met with an unsympathetic judge, a large costs bill and an unsaleable property, thanks to the conveyancing rules. Now, I say unsympathetic judge because judges, like everybody else, are human beings, and they get to a point where they've had enough of them as well. And I'm thinking specifically of some of the cases I've dealt with where after they've heard a sufficient amount, they effectively would like to say, enough, we've heard enough. Why can't you just settle this? Which is why the last chapter is so useful on mediation, because mediation may well, in some cases, help. Obviously, as I say, the losing party, of course, still has to live with the neighbour from hell, and that's always the problem. Of course, you do end up, as many find, that the property becomes unsaleable, so you can't move anyway. So the problem is, think about what you're doing. That's the one point I'd make. And a parting comment also in the book comes with this point, that parties should try to settle as soon as possible. Always a good idea. This book, I think, helps immensely because it might give some constructive advice about the approach, because most problems often remain intractable, and it's estimated, as I say, at least a quarter of the population have a major neighbourhood problem. It can be much higher, of course, in the city areas. Of course, the country areas with boundary disputes is a very substantial difficulty in its own right, especially where you may not have registered land, or you may have problems concerning what's actually in title deeds. So the point is, the problems may never be resolved, so you've been warned. That's the difficulty. But it's a great book, and I'd like to thank Alexander Walsh very much and of course Law Brief Publishing for producing it. The authors endeavoured to state the law as at the 20th of December 2019, and the publication of the book came out on the 19th of February 2020. There it is again. And then on the back you can see a little bit of blurb. Then you can see the other books in the series, and in fact there are quite a large number of books there. These practical guides are all listed in the back by Law Brief Publishing. I don't review very many of them, but this one was a particularly useful book, and I was most impressed. So I'm very grateful to Law Brief Publishing for sending it to me. Thank you to all, anyway, for an excellent book. Bye-bye.